Hello, and welcome to the lecture on animal and human conflict. In this presentation, we'll be learning about how all species have conflict and competition as part of their heritage, and we'll be looking at some examples of how it continues to play out today. We know from our lecture on evolution and natural selection that animals will inherit the characteristics of those who were successful at survival and reproduction in the past. We have to ask then, what determines success? And the answer to that question is access to things that increase survival and reproduction. If you remember from that lecture, time and resources are finite. So individuals have to compete for access to resources, time, mates, and the other things that can increase survival and reproduction. And that's how we measure success, and that's what we call fitness. So animals who are successful get more food, will use less energy, will find more mates and attract more mates, and will raise successful offspring. And this is why competition is inherent in evolution by natural selection. Now, there are many ways for animals to compete. They can compete by efficiency. So this sloth uses less energy than her competitors. She may be more likely to survive a famine or other scarcities of resources by outliving her competition. We know that animals also engage with combat, either competing with predators or competing with one another. We'll be discussing elephant seals in a little bit, or competing for mates in terms of sexiness, like our old friend the peacock. And this jacana, who in this species, the females are more brilliantly colored than the males because the females will compete over attraction of males to help them rear their chicks. So we know that natural selection produces characteristics that increase the survival and reproductive success of an individual. Natural selection is the process by which differential survival and reproduction between individuals results in differential production of offspring. Offspring of successful individuals are more likely to be successful themselves. So in this manner, natural selection produces the characteristics that increase the survival and reproductive success of an individual. And individuals who are competitive leave behind more descendants. And this is why altruism in its pure sense is so rare. We don't expect individuals to be doing things for the good of the group. If an individual says, hey, no big deal, you can have my territory, go ahead, that individual may not have any territory, may not attract any mates, may not have any offspring. The selfish individual, the one who took advantage of its competitor, will be the one who produces offspring. So we expect natural selection to increase the competition of individuals with one another. And when we're comparing fitness, when we're comparing survival and reproductive success, we're always comparing within a population. So in this sense, the traits that make individuals more competitive are those that we'll see increase within a population. And we'll see the evolution of populations to include more competitive traits. So we'll very rarely see true altruism. Now we'll get back to how competition can produce cooperation at the end of this presentation and into the next one. So among mammals, males tend to fight more than females fight. The general pattern among mammals is that female success tends to be limited by access to resources. So female reproductive success is measured in production of offspring. Females are limited by the number of pregnancies that they can sustain and bring to term. Males tend to be limited by access to mates. So the more mates that males find, the more offspring they produce. So you see here two elephant seals fighting for control over the beach. Whichever male controls the beach will be able to monopolize mateships with all of the females who come to raise pups on the beach. So these males' reproductive success, the number of offspring that these males can produce, is limited by their access to mates, and in this case, their access to resources like the beach affects their access to mates. And one key factor here is that among mammals, there is much greater variance in male success in terms of reproductive success which means that there's a stronger selection pressure for traits that increase competitive abilities. So let's take a look at some of the elephant seal data. This is a chart showing you the reproductive success of male and female elephant seals in terms of number of weaned pups. So we're measuring reproductive success by number of weaned pups, pups who made it through infancy. And we have ranked the males and females in order of most successful in terms of number of weaned pups to least successful. And one of the first things that you can see here, oops, wrong way, there we go, is that a few males have all of the babies. So there's one male, the most successful male, is having, looks like about 90, 95 pups. But by number 10, out of 140 males, there is 0. So 10 males are having all of the reproductive success. The most competitive 10 males out of 140 are the ones having all of the babies. This means that there's a very large variance in reproductive success. It varies from 0 to 95. Female reproductive success doesn't vary quite as much, although it does still vary. In this case, we have more females, up to 68 females having babies, but the maximum number of babies that any female produces is 10. So there's a smaller variance, anywhere from 0 to 10, but there are many more females having some reproductive success. This means that there's a different game for male and females. Males among elephant seals, it's pretty much all or nothing. If you're not competitive enough to get access to a beach, you won't be having any offspring. So when we say that there's a very strong selection pressure for competitive traits, we mean that only a few of the males in the population are getting to have offspring. And in order to do so, they have to be very competitive. They have to outfight 130 other male elephant seals. Females are competing too, but because there's less variance, the selection pressure isn't as strong. And we call this sexual selection. This is the second type of natural selection that we're discussing. We also have previously talked about kin selection. Sexual selection is a type of natural selection where successful individuals out-reproduce others. So you're competing for reproductive success. Remember, natural selection has two components, survival and reproduction. So when we discuss reproduction, we're talking about sexual selection. And there's two types of sexual selection. There's intra-sexual selection. Intra means within. So fights for access to mates and resources between members of the same sex. And this is where the elephant seals fall. So within a sex, within the male sex, males are fighting other males for access to mates and resources, like the beach. The other type of sexual selection is intersexual selection, and this is between the sexes. If you need a clue for which is which, inter has an E and between has lots of E's in it. So between the sexes. This means you're competing to be the most attractive. And we see this a lot in birds. Our friend the peacock is a good example. These birds are competing for notice by the opposite sex. And in many species, like humans, we see both of these types of sexual selection occurring. We see members fighting other members of the same sex for access to mates, and we also see members of one sex competing for notice by the other. Now you might be thinking, well, we've been doing a lot of reading about cooperation in this class. Why does it seem that competition is so important for natural selection? And we've talked about kin selection. How does kin selection work if it's all about competition of individuals? Kin selection is unique and a really interesting topic to discuss because individuals are essentially cooperating to compete. You can think back to the prairie dog example. They stand up and give alarm calls when they see predators, but they're much more likely to do so when kin are around. Now, think about several family groups living out in the prairies of Yosemite, and kin groups can have differential survival and reproductive success. And the kin groups who have individuals within them who alarm call might be more likely to survive and more likely to produce more offspring. So in this case, groups that cooperate are more competitive as a group. Now this is limited to small groups of close kin. This does not mean that animals do things for the good of the species. They do things to benefit others when they know that they'll get paid back, or when natural selection has produced behaviors that increase the payback for doing something to help your kin. So of course this is also limited to species where kin live near one another. So prairie dogs live in family groups, at least the females tend to stick around their other females. In some species like fish, where everybody disperses, there's no point in trying to help kin because you won't be able to affect them. And the help has to be able to affect the relative's fitness. So if you're a helpful prairie dog with a deaf family, you might not be able to affect their ability to escape predators. We'll also be discussing more about the limits of cooperation in future lectures. Okay, so we haven't talked much about humans. Human competition occurs for many of the same reasons as it does in other species. Humans compete for access to resources. Humans compete for access to land, access to animals. In fact, most of human deaths over the course of our species history would be considered fighting over access to animals and land and other resources. But we also see inter- and intra-sexual selection occurring. So we fight others for access to mates, such as duels, and this is intra-sexual selection, and we fight for attractiveness to the opposite sex, intersexual selection. Interestingly, we also fight for access to status and power over other human beings because we are so dependent on others' help that having high status can help increase the amount of help you get from other individuals. So this top left picture is the top of the head of a Yanomamo man who has been in a pole fight several times, and these are the resulting scars. And Yanomamo men who are seen as more fierce get more respect, tend to get more wives and other types of resources. But human competition differs from that of other species. First of all, it's on a larger scale. This is the Brusilov offensive during World War I, and it's estimated that about 1.6 million people died in this battle in what is now modern-day Ukraine. So it's much larger scale than other species. Often people are cooperating groups of non-kin. Their participation can be anonymous. And I said that word cooperation. Warfare requires cooperation. You bet. In order to have large groups competing with one another, you have to cooperate within your group. And we'll be discussing this in the next presentation on male coalitional violence. Thanks for listening.